Hi there. This is Ben Morse. I am a product manager at Google working on Chrome, and I'm very, very pleased to introduce an amazing musician and also a coder, Dan Tepfer.
Hey Ben,
Like magic, there he is. Hi, Dan. How are you doing today?
I'm well. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm very glad to have you here. Dan and I talked yesterday for half an hour, then an additional half an hour, then an additional half an hour. He's a fascinating person with many ideas about music, about structures, how these things intertwine, all kinds of things. So first of all, I did go to Google search and look you up, and it said you were a French pianist. Then I asked Bard, and it said you were a French American pianist. So Bard knew things that Google didn't.
Bard
Maybe just say a
wins.
bit about, yeah, there you go. Bard is on top here. Can you say a bit about your background and how you came to be here today?
Yeah, my folks are American. They're from Oregon, and they moved to France in 1978, and so I was actually born there and lived there for the first 18 years of my life. So I am Franco-American. I have both passports, and this also kind of connects into, I would say, the multiple cultures that I have outside of nationality. Like my grandfather was a jazz pianist actually on the West Coast, but my mom was an opera singer. She sang in the Paris Opera Chorus for decades, and so I really grew up with these multiple cultures, both musical and non-musical, in the house. And then also my father was a biologist, a research biologist. So all these things kind of came together in a soup in who I am.
You have these strong music and sort of technical backgrounds, which is common for many Googlers. A lot of Googlers do play music in some way or write music. I'm among those people. I'm somebody who was a programmer kid, really into computers. I got really into music. I came back to tech. And I'm curious about your journey because I believe you actually did study astrophysicists as an undergraduate. And then astrophysics, sorry. You were an astrophysicist in training. And then you went from there to go to NEC in Boston to study music. And how did this come about?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, the science and music have always coexisted really strongly in who I was. I remember as a tiny little kid asking my dad questions about the universe and about being fascinated with the idea of infinity and the idea that things could go on forever in space and in time. And so when it came time to go to college, I actually wanted to do a double degree in music and science because I was also super passionate about music, but that wasn't possible at the school that I went to for my undergrad, the University of Edinburgh. So I figured it'd be a lot easier to study astrophysics and do music on the side than it would be to study music and do astrophysics on the side. So I did that, but then probably a year into that degree, I just felt super strongly that I had to give being a professional musician a go and see what would happen. And then for my master's, I got into the New England Conservatory, as you mentioned, in Boston, and had some great teachers there. Then moved to New York, and yeah, been working as a professional musician for the last almost couple decades.
And it seems to worked out pretty well because you are still here. And you've played a lot
Yeah.
of jazz with some very interesting people too, right? Lee Konitz, for example.
Yeah, Lee Konitz has been maybe the most important influence on me musically, especially when we're talking about connecting with the deep history of jazz and thinking seriously about improvisation at both the kind of technical level, but also at the spiritual level. So Lee Konitz was one of the great jazz legends. Like Miles Davis in his autobiography has very nice things to say about Lee Konitz.
Wow, that is something.
He actually in his autobiography, I remember he mentions that certain of his peers, of Miles Davis's peers, criticized him for hiring Lee in the Birth of the Cool sessions, basically because Lee was a white guy. And Miles said in his autobiography, he says, if somebody plays like that, I don't care if he's green. It's still great. Anyway, so yeah, I played with Lee for 12 years, recorded with him, learned a lot from him, and I've also been really lucky to play with some other jazz greats. So it's been a kind of a dream time of getting into New York City and becoming a part of the scene.
Yeah, still a place where there's a lot of fantastic jazz musicians, and you can go to like a small club or a bar somewhere in Brooklyn or somewhere in Attleboro and hear fantastic musicians playing fantastic music.
Yeah.
It is that kind of place. So, given all this background in jazz, what led you to start playing along with yourself by using algorithms and software to create your own accompaniment?
Yeah. Let's see. So if I do this, it does that. So that's like, I'm here at this wonderful instrument that's actually on loan to me from Yamaha. This is a Yamaha disc clavier, and it's a completely acoustic piano, but it has this special ability to play all by itself. It's basically like a modern day player piano, the same as those pianos were in the early 20th century with the piano rolls. And as I mentioned, I've been into science and since I was a kid, and I actually started programming as a kid too. I've always loved coding, although coding and music were completely unrelated domains to me for a lot of my life growing up. I loved programming like 3D graphics and very rudimentary rendering engines when I was a teenager. But then in my 20s, the way that I started connecting the two worlds is that I was studying with a teacher in Boston who had some very advanced ear training exercises. And I realized they were really hard to do. Like you basically had to do them with somebody else. They're very hard to do alone. And so I thought, oh wait, I could write a program to do the ear training exercise for me. And I did that. And then it was suddenly like, ding, a light bulb went off. Like, I'm getting the computer to make sound. Obviously, I could use some of the ideas that I know about how music works and see what that would spit out. And so for a while, I was writing programs that wrote generative music. But the problem with the generative music I was writing is that it always sounded really mechanical to me. It sounded kind of robotic and just lacked that deep human quality that is kind of why I listen to music in the first place. And so then I discovered this instrument, the Yamaha disc clavier, and I realized that instead of using pure logic as the basis for the generative music I was writing, I could use my own input, what I myself am playing as a human being, flesh and bone, as the material for what the computer does in response. And then you get this thing where these two worlds meet. Of what I like to call the natural and the mechanical. And this is why this project is called Natural Machines. It's this idea of music existing at the intersection of, for lack of a better word, the algorithmic on the one hand and the spiritual on the other. And that's where this got really exciting to me, is combining this world of pure logic with intuition, emotion, and what makes us human.
Which I find so intriguing because I myself, as a youngster who was really into analyzing music and coding and playing music, my college thesis wrote a program that wrote original tunes. And somewhere along the way, I thought, okay, I need a heuristic to say, is this better or is this better? I realized,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I don't actually know. I'm a computer. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
what's actually better. And I feel
Yeah.
like by using yourself as the input, there's a human element that wouldn't normally be there by just generating pure MIDI or pure sound.
Totally. And so the way I like to look at this is that logical systems and strong structure is essential to good music. There's no doubt about that. But you can go too far in that direction. So an example of that is the school of total serialism. Okay, so you know about the school of serialism that emerged with Schoenberg and Berg and Webern. It's what's called the Second Viennese School. Schoenberg came up with a system to make atonal music. And what he said is you got to play all 12 notes before you can play any of them again. And that kind of enforces atonality. And so that was all well and good. But then after the Second World War, some composers like Boulez, for example, took this idea even further and they said, well, not only can we impose a system like that on pitch content, but we can also impose a system like that on dynamics, we can impose it on large-scale structure, we can impose it on timbre. Essentially, they got to a place where the logical system was predicting the entire piece. And what you kind of notice pretty quickly when you listen to that music is that it just doesn't sound that good. And in fact, Boulez even admitted that decades later. There's this interview with Boulez where he says, yeah, maybe back in those days we didn't think enough
Mistakes
about
were
how the
made.
music sounded. And And so like I like to contrast that approach where you are removing all the degrees of freedom and just kind of over determining the music, to what Bach does. And Bach is to me kind of the poster child for good music, and Bach uses algorithms a lot. His all his music is supported by the rules of counterpoint, which are strictly algorithmic. I've actually written some programs that make music using the rules of counterpoint. He's also imposes other algorithms on himself, such as the rules of canon or the rules of fugue. But he's smart enough to never let these logical systems overdetermine the music. There's always really significant degrees of freedom. I would say 50% or more, where he has to show up with his intuition, with his emotions, with his spirituality, because that's I think a relevant word in this discussion, and make choices from the heart. And right there, where the heart and the brain meet, you can make some good music, I think.
So I left the academy actually too because there's this wonderful German word Augenmusik, music for the eyes. It looks really good. You can make systems 12 different dynamics, 12 different everything. I had a professor who actually decided to systemize timbres as well. He found 12 different timbres. He decided to use vowels, 12 different vowels. To create systems where you just would hear these vowels at different pitches. It sounded like a bunch of vowels. At no point did you ever think, well, it sound good or sound bad. And that's the part that I'm glad that you have maintained over here, that there's a spiritual element to it. And you were telling me before about how music to you also is about an act of generosity with the audience and communication.
Well, I think we're talking about the specific thing, which is, let's say you're a novelist, and or let me give you an even better example. Let's say you're a philosopher at heart, and you come up with some radical idea, a radical philosophy, a radical way of looking at the world, and it's exciting to you. Like you think you've stumbled upon something important. You could just keep that to yourself. You could talk about it at dinner parties with your friends. You could just kind of enjoy it with yourself and with your close ones, right? But it takes a huge amount of work to do what, for example, Dostoevsky did in The Idiot, which is, really a kind of a radical philosophical idea disguised as a novel. And so he goes to this huge amount of work of writing an incredibly engaging novel that he knows, because he's good at this craft, will hold people's attention, will make people want to keep reading. And he does this, sure, he probably needed the money, but also I really see it as an act of generosity, of putting things in a form that speaks to people, that speaks to other people. And I think that's a huge part of making music. You come up with all these great ideas, and Bach, again, had all kinds of wonderful kind of abstract ideas. But then he goes to the trouble of asking himself, okay, let's say I came up with this idea of the invention, which is something very dear to my heart right now, because I have a new record called Inventions, Reinventions coming out next month, where I play the inventions by Bach and then I improvise inventions for the missing keys. Let's say that Bach, it comes up with this idea for inventions, which is essentially this idea of using classical narrative structure to create these miniature pieces. He could just write a demonstration piece of that doesn't sound that good. But instead, he asks himself, okay, is this a beautiful melody? Is every melody in here singable? Like if I read this, if I sang this, would I truly enjoy singing each one of these melodies? So he's going from that place of humanity, and that to me is an act of generosity towards the audience. He is encapsulating these ideas in an incredibly attractive form. He's making it really fun and beautiful for us.
Speaking of the audience and generosity, maybe you should play us something. And I think it might spark some audience questions, possibly. If you have questions or comments as we go, please drop those in the chat, and we'll be looking at those as we go. Because, yeah, you get to actually see what he's doing, because he actually has visualizations for certain pieces as well.
Yeah, for pretty much everything I do, that visualizations have become a really important part of Natural Machines. And I think maybe I'll play. So I should mention a couple things. First of all, in this project, Natural Machines, I've written every line of code myself. I like to say that the code is just as homemade as the music that I'm playing at the piano.
What language do you use, by the way, for the audience out there? Are you a Python
So for the
programmer?
music stuff, I like to use Super Collider, which is this relatively fringe programming language that specializes in music that was developed in the 90s. I really like it. It's pure code. And then the visuals I've written in an environment that you're probably familiar with called processing, which is a layer over Java specialized in making graphics for artists. And the other thing I was going to mention is that in natural machines, everything is improvisation. There's no music written. Really, in natural machines, I've written the way that the music works as opposed to actually writing the music itself. And so right now, I think I'll play with this algorithm that I call inversion, where everything I play is mirrored around the center of the piano and played back a little bit later as a canon, but as an inverted canon, which, by the way, is something Bach does too in variations 12 and 15 of the Goldberg Variations. And yeah, you'll see that I designed the visuals to try to make this symmetry as obvious as possible.
Very nice. So if you saw that and you have questions or comments, please stick those in the chat. We can look at those as we go over here. We also have a Q&A section at the end for just questions. I have a lot of questions, so I haven't seen that. Again, one thing I'm thinking about is that how is it playing along with yourself, like a bit later as it happens? You know, I think you've done inverted, offset by a little bit versus playing with a human being who maybe is listening to you in some way and building off what you're playing. I mean, my first thought was, oh, well, in this case, you can change chords whenever you want to change chords, change harmonies, because no one's there playing bass trying to keep up with you. But also, it's inverting what you're playing. So when you finally played that last B flat major chord, I thought, how did he do that? Because it would be inverted, and it might not sound like that in the end. So there's a lot of stuff in that question.
Well, so what I love about imposing rules on yourself, and again, this is something composers have done for a very, very long time, and artists too, right? So what I love about imposing constraints on yourself is that it kind of naturally leads you to certain places without having decided to go to those places before. The system itself leads you there. And so, when I first started working with this inversion algorithm, and by the way, I see a question from Laura Arroyo asking if I'm also mirroring the key velocity. No, I'm actually using the exact same key velocity that I'm playing. If I were to mirror that, actually, it would kind of completely change the tenor of a melody, and so that really, it wouldn't actually make sense. And this is another one of the interesting questions that comes up when you're working with algorithms, is like, what makes actual musical sense? Like, which algorithms go deep into what makes music tick, and which ones are just kind of random, and we can come back to that. But just to answer your question, so what I love about constraints is they lead you to these places that you didn't expect to go to. So when I first designed this inversion algorithm, I was just playing atonally. I would do stuff like and that's a lot of fun, but there's something a little bit random about it to me. And also, I think that whole era of like free jazz, free atonal jazz, I think to me it has kind of played its course. So I'm interested in bringing harmony and consonance to the world. And so then the question for me came up of, if I'm going to play in a chord or in a key or in a mode, is there a way with the inversion algorithm for that to remain in the same place? So is there a way to mirror what I'm playing so that it's still in the same mode? And then I realized what you need for that is a palindromic mode. So, for those of you who are not music nerds in the audience, a palindromic, well, mode is a collection of notes, typically 7, but it could be more than that or less. And so a palindromic mode will be one that has the same intervals going up as going down. So an example of this is Dorian, which I won't demonstrate, but Dorian is the same going up as going down.
Yeah,
and so if I play in the Dorian mode that has as its axis of symmetry the same axis that I'm using, that I happen to be using right now, then whatever I play will be mirrored onto that same mode, right? And so right now, one of the modes that gets mirrored onto the same mode is B flat major. But that's also true of E major, like, so I haven't changed anything about the axis right now. And obviously all the diatonic chords of those regions too, like F sharp minor. And then a more exotic mode like F minor diminished. And there's a whole bunch of them. But so anyway, that's what I love about this. It's like you come up with an idea and then it just forces you to find solutions. And in this case, it led me to this idea of palindromic modes that I'd never even seriously thought about before.
Yeah, I guess it forces you to find the things that work best with it. And also it augments what you're playing already. I've seen this done before. I remember, this is a story. I remember seeing the bassist Chuck Hayden playing a solo, and someone had written
Charlie Hayden?
Yes. Someone had written something which was going to play along with him. So it was going to listen to what he played and play an accompaniment, because it was generating this on the fly. So they set up, and the computer didn't work. So he's playing this beautiful long bass solo, and with nothing out, we saw the other guy on stage trying to mess with MIDI cables and things and restarting the computer. And finally, 5 minutes in, it began to work. It spat out all this horrible garbagey noise and it kind of ruined the performance, because the computer is making up stuff it thought might be kind of useful in the moment. You're using yourself, so you have control over it, but it's modifying it and just building what you're already doing.
Yeah. I think the idea of feedback mechanisms is really essential to music. There's this fascinating research that shows that when two humans play together, their mirror neurons are being activated in an incredibly powerful and very intricate way. And that's all about feedback. It's all about like, okay, I do something, and then I am aware of what that creates in the world, what kind of feedback I get from that thing that I did. And then I will adjust. I will adjust what I do in the future according to that feedback. And so in this case, what the computer does in response to me is directly correlated to what I'm playing. I mean, it depends on the algorithm. I've written a whole bunch of different algorithms here. But it's directly a result of what I play. And then, of course, once the computer responds to me, I'm, as an improviser, adjusting what I do in response to it. And so at the end of the day, you asked this question a little earlier about how is it to play with this algorithm as opposed to a human being? I found at the end of the day that the most important thing for me is to actually carefully listen to what the computer is playing, like as if I were playing with another person. Because the minute it becomes kind of decoration to what I play, then I think everything falls apart. It has to feel just like an equal partner in the creation of the music.
Like it is a conversation still between two musicians.
Mm-hmm.
Other one is
And two equal musicians, yeah. Not one who's lording it over the other, We've all seen that happen.
Oh, yes. Been there on both sides of that one. One sort of spontaneous question over here. You may be aware of the project called Magenta, which comes from Google, where they generate music based on a trained model. Mm-hmm. I can imagine you training a model based on your own playing. You could then play things sort of like what you play. It wouldn't be the same kind of improvisational in the moment thing, although perhaps that also is possible. Have you ever considered trying one of these new machine learning things?
Yeah, I have actually. I have an association with IRCAM, the Music Research Institute in Paris, and there's a researcher there named Gérard Assayag who has a program that learns from what you're playing and then responds in really interesting ways. I'm interested in these things at an intellectual level, but I have a kind of a particular bias, which is that I've spent my life becoming proficient or becoming competent at playing this instrument, at playing the piano. I give solo concerts of Bach's music, and I played, as we mentioned, with great jazz musicians. This is like my life, and so I don't want the computer to replace me. I have no interest in that. My only interest is seeing if the computer can augment what I do, and if the computer can draw things out of me as an artist that I would not have thought of before. And that's really what's been the case with natural machines. It's just led to so much music that I never would have created without it.
And so far, these models can kind of, draw together things humans have done and mush them together and spit out something else that sounds like it. But I guess there isn't still that human element, whatever that might be.
Yeah, well, I think, the big thing with AI models at this point, and we really see this in ChatGPT and probably in Bard too, although I haven't used Bard yet, is that they're aping the surface. They're superficial creatures at this point, and so there are neural networks that can mimic the surface of Bach's music pretty decently. Actually, remember there was a Google Doodle a few years ago that did Bach chorales, but they had mistakes. It was basically like a superficial imitation without understanding the truth of the underlying concepts, and that's really what's missing at this point. It'll be interesting to see where we get to within 5 years or something. But at this point, all that stuff sounds to me like an incredibly genius, like 5-year-old or something. It's just like so good at the surface, without understanding anything.
Like a really good student. I mean, 30 years ago, they could generate piano sonatas that sounded kind of like Mozart, but just not quite as good. And also, if Mozart was alive today, he'd be doing something else probably. I think part of music is they can give things that feel like they have some meaning in the moment.
Yeah, right. That's a great point. It's about, it's not just making music, it's making art, which is, which I think most people would agree, needs to respond to the times that the art is being made in. I see we have a bunch of interesting questions. Should we check some of them out?
I was looking at a couple of those. I was going to get into the Goldberg Variations discussing in Bach, but you're right. There's a couple of questions we saved. I wonder if our moderators can pop this up on the screen spontaneously. Oh, look at this. They can. So should I read this? I mean, I could summarize it. Jim asks if you've gone back to Bach and try to see how much you actually could code to recreate it by playing part of it. And the algorithm recreating the rest of it by itself?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, but what you will find, and I guarantee this, is that you will never be able to write an algorithm that will predict the entirety of Bach's piece just based on, the first four bars or whatever. Even in his most deterministic pieces, something like a fugue form, which is very strict. As I mentioned, there are just so many degrees of freedom. I mean, in the third entrance of the second voice, or no, let's say in the third statement of the theme, he decides to invert all the themes. That's not something that's built into the form. That's just his decision. Like he's literally writing this piece and he says to himself, you know what, we've heard this theme enough in its initial position. Let's invert it or let's retrograde it. And that's just totally based on his sense of, are we bored yet? Which I don't, there's no algorithm that's going to predict that, at least not at this point. What you can do is write algorithms, as I've done, that use the rules of counterpoint, that maybe go even a little deeper and program the rules of fugue, and you could spit out a fugue. But at this point, it's not going to sound as inspired as Bach, and it's not going to have that same sense of proportion and all these things that make Bach so wonderful. Speaking of Bach, maybe I should show this Bach upside down stuff I've been doing.
Sure, I'd be really curious to see you working with Bach, either improvising on Bach or Bach upside down.
Yeah, so during the
Both.
pandemic, when the pandemic hit, all my gigs were canceled, and I immediately asked myself, okay, what can I do right now on my own? And one of the projects I've been interested in for a long time is asking myself, what does Bach sound like upside down? So by upside down, I mean in chromatic inversion, and I think the results are kind of shocking. I'm going to play you the first Goldberg variation.
And for the
And
audience, chromatic means he's not playing in the same scale necessarily. He's not taking like the 7 notes of the scale and inverting it. He's using all 12 notes of the scale to invert it precisely numerically.
yeah, and what it means when you're doing a chromatic inversion is that you're making virtually zero choices, or actually you're really making no choices at all. Like you are hearing exactly the same thing that went into it, just upside down. It's like taking a picture of the Mona Lisa and going like that. So here's Bach's Goldberg Variation number 1. I'm going to play it, and then this program I wrote is going to play exactly what I just played back, but inverted. Isn't that cool? I can never get over that. I mean, like, I can say that because I didn't do anything. All I'm doing is turning it upside down. But it's shocking to me how good that sounds. And that comes back to this idea of structure on the one hand, algorithms meeting intuition, because you turn something like that upside down, the forces that make counterpoint tick. Counterpoint is the art of writing melodies that develop in time, but where together the instantaneous relationships between notes are pleasing, right? Or if they're not pleasing, they resolve in a way that's pleasing. And so the thing about turning something upside down like that is that all those relationships remain the same. All the intervals are the same. The only difference is that things resolve upwards instead of downwards. But so the counterpoint still sounds amazing. And to me, it's just like re-experiencing Bach, but if he was born on Mars or something like that.
I think Bach also might probably enjoy this too, because he'd recognize what was happening. And when I heard that, I had a bunch of thoughts sail by in my head. One thought was, oh, it sounds kind of like Bach. One was, it sounds like it was like a more modern composer doing a fugue, somebody like a Hindemith or someone like that, or maybe even a Stravinsky. And then it sounds kind of like, oh, a computer generated this, because it feels like it's legal, but harmonically, it's not following the usual rules that I expect it to follow.
Yeah, and I think that tells you so much about style, right? It's like everything here is exactly what Bach wrote, and you turn it upside down and it suddenly sounds like a different style, even though it's the same data. So style is, it's like language. You speak in Victorian English versus modern slang, and it sounds really different, but the ideas that you're expressing might be exactly the same ones.
And I guess what's different about it to me, maybe, well, not mostly. One thing that's very different about it is if you hear Bach, usually it's a journey from, 1 to 5 back to one or minor 1 to 3. You can feel this journey is happening. And the journey isn't there in the same way anymore. It's kind of like we're going to go a little major. We'll go a little minor. We'll go to E flat. Now we're going to go to G major. He's kind of wandering around from place to place, but you still
I
feel the
mean, the
same
journey
momentum.
the journey is still there in the same way. It's just that we're not used to hearing it this way, and so it's just a lot harder to identify
Mm.
what's going on harmonically. But actually, the harmonic movement is exactly the same, but inverted. So, like, say you're in G major and you go to the 5, so you go to D major, right? You invert that. That what will happen is you're starting in G minor, and then you go to the 4. You go to C minor. But like all these key relationships remain the same, just upside down.
You may just get a different feeling because the tools you would use to change keys gradually, like adding a couple of sharps here and there, or adding a couple of flats to kind of merge towards the key, or going to 5 of 5 before you go to 5, would all be different. But you've done this more than I have, obviously. You probably have noticed patterns you can recognize now, hearing these things inverted. That makes sense in this way.
Well, yeah. I mean, this actually, what in jazz and in music we call negative harmony. That's a term that was coined by Steve Coleman. Is something that I've been
Yeah.
into for a really long time. So, just as an example, here's all the things you are. This jazz standard. Those are the first 2 A's of all the things you are. Upside down, that sounds like this. So it's exactly the same process that I'm applying to Bach, but applying it in more of a jazz way, where we're talking about these abstract ideas of chord symbols with melody.
That's a great example because you can feel the first song travels around the circles of fifths in a certain direction. This kind of
Hmm.
relaxing jazz, always resolving way. The way it's
Yeah,
always going the other way, like it's always getting more tense instead of less tense.
totally. So
You
instead of
feel that.
moving upwards by fourths, you're actually moving downwards by fourths in the inversion, and what that does is it kind of makes it sound like a pop song, because in pop music, like since the 90s or something, you have that kind of motion so much, that downwards movement by fourths.
And we also haven't covered this. You have also played along with Bach, and you've played Bach and added in your own material to Bach.
Yeah,
And how
yeah.
does
So
that
I
feel?
well, my feeling about Bach is that you can't improve upon it. I think these are masterpieces for all time, and I just love playing his music and learning from it, and I wouldn't change it. But what I do think is perfectly legal, and I think makes sense, is to respond to it, to have a dialogue with it. So I put out a record in 2011 called Goldberg Variations, where I play the 30 Goldberg Variations, and then after each one of his variations, I improvise a variation of my own, which with the Goldberg Variations makes a particular amount of sense because Bach is doing something in them that in many ways resembles what jazz musicians do when they play over a jazz standard. He states this beautiful theme at the beginning, the aria. Playing it very quickly here, just in the interest of time, but that's this beautiful melody that he plays at the beginning that has an accompanying chord structure, and then what he does in the subsequent 30 variations is he takes that chord structure and he invents new melodic, emotional, rhythmic, virtuosic ideas on top of that chord structure that's acting as a frame for the whole thing. So this is very similar to what we do in jazz when we improvise, like on All the Things You Are. You keep the chord structure of the melody running, and then you improvise new ideas over it, using it as your frame. So that's what I do in the project, in the Goldberg Variations project, is I use the same frame as Bach, use the same chord structures, I often steal ideas from him, like thematic ideas or even structural ideas, because every third variation in the Goldbergs is a canon at a rising interval, things like that. But then I'll respond to those ideas in my own voice. And actually, I mentioned I have a record coming up next month called Inventions, Reinventions. And that's, again, a dialogue with Bach. I play the 15 inventions that he composed. And then for the 9 missing keys, because there are 9 keys he didn't write inventions for, I improvise inventions of my own. And in this case, I'm also taking the same frame as Bach, but it's an enormously more abstract frame, because it's not like, oh, he played these chords, or he played in this time signature, or he used this theme. It's really this very abstract idea of how does Bach tell a story in music, and in particular, what does the harmonic landscape in which he allows himself to move look like, and can I use that idea of harmonic landscape in free improvisation?
I know that, I mean, the time of Beethoven and Mozart, they improvise things all the time as part of what they did. I imagine Bach also improvised things as well
Bach was
himself
actually most famous in his lifetime as an improviser.
at the organ.
He,
Is that right?
yeah, he was a great organ improviser. I mean, I think, towards the end of his life, he was challenged to improvise a fugue on a given theme, and I think that he was doing on a harpsichord. Bach didn't really matter what instrument it was, but he was famous as an improviser. By all accounts, he's one of the great improvisers of all time. Yeah.
We should get into questions, I believe, but one more thing I want to ask you about. You've got this thing, is it called Far Trip? Back to the coding part of your life.
Farplay, yeah.
Farplay,
Yeah.
or something. What is this Farplay that you have?
Farplay is a startup I have, and it emerged because during the pandemic, as a jazz musician, it really broke my heart to not be able to play with other musicians. And like most people, I thought it was impossible to play music through the internet. The latency would be way too much. But in fact, there was a research project from Stanford called Jack Trip that I got involved with that showed that you can do this, but it was pretty impossible to use. And so with my partner Anton Runoff, we put together. We took quite a while, but we developed this app called Farplay that allows musicians to play music through the internet together in a way that is the absolute lowest latency you can possibly have. And within 1,000 miles, it can be completely imperceptible. You can get like sub 20 millisecond latencies, which is equivalent to playing with somebody in a room who's 20 feet away, because sound moves in air at 1 foot per millisecond. And then coast to coast, 3,000 miles, New York to LA or something like that. It's really shocking how good the music can feel. You get about 40 milliseconds at that distance. So I encourage anyone who's interested in music to check it out, farplay.io.
Try it. It's something which was thought to be, I thought, impossible without going and changing your router settings or really getting into the weeds, but apparently you can just download the app and try it.
Yeah, I mean, it helps a lot to be on Ethernet. But aside from that, you don't have to do anything to your router, and it's one piece of software. It's really like we've tried to make it as easy to use as Google Meet.
Which is very easy to use.
Yes.
I want to see you play some more. We have some more questions we wanted to get to. One of our kind people. There we go. Joe has a question. Have you ever tried giving the computer a song structure like a lead sheet, but allowing it to interpret and improvise with you on top of it?
Yeah, that is actually something I have messed around with. I'm not really that interested in that. Like, to me, it's you're going to get what you would imagine, which is it's going to sound like a robot playing over a chord structure. What I'm interested in when I work with computers is creating new music, is arriving at results that I just could not have expected before. And I really love this idea of using simple algorithms that actually improvise with me, because that's where I can just explore. I can just enter this world. It feels like visiting like another planet or something that has different rules of physics, or not necessarily the different laws of physics, but like, let's say, different gravitation, different atmospheric density, and having to find a way to dance. Maybe I should show another one of these ideas.
I'd be curious to see some more of these things. Yeah.
So here's Here's one called tremolo, which is super simple. Like everything I play is turned into a tremolo, but it just really orients the music in a certain way. So this is just me, very quickly giving a taste of what these algorithms do, because when I play this show live, every one of these can be a long exploration, and it's, as I say, like visiting this world and then just playing around in it. Should I show you something else just really quick to?
I'd be curious. That one saves you a lot of calories, playing all those notes again and again and again like that. Just do it once. I had a Steve Reich moment there.
Yeah. Minimalism definitely rears its head in this project. Like there's this algorithm I call constant motion. The idea of constant motion is a very minimalistic idea. That school with Steve Reich and Philip Glass and Don Adams. And check this out. I'll play you just I'll just play around with this for a couple minutes.
I'm sorry it isn't live. We can't be having people clapping anymore. Actually, when this is live, how do you deal with visualizations? Have you tried that before, having a screen or something where you see these
Oh yeah,
patterns?
yeah. I've toured this all over the
Yeah.
world. I just did 4 shows of this in Australia in a planetarium actually. So
Oh,
the
that's a good
graphics
choice.
were
Yeah.
projected over the entire dome, and everybody was lying back, and I really loved that. That was a lot of fun. But I've done it in a lot of places. Just did it in Japan in a big concert hall where they had the whole back of the stage as a screen, and so the graphics were being projected just on the screen. I would love to do this where it's like being projected on the side of a building sometime. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
One cool thing about it is you can follow along with, you can tell what's happening visually. Often you go to a concert and the music isn't one you've heard before. You get lost at some point in the structure of it, but here it's always
Hmm.
displayed in front of you. I mean, also it changed with time. There's a point where all these colorful circles appeared in the middle of that. Does that always happen at a certain time, or is that triggered by something in the music? Or how does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I love the idea of, on the one hand, I need to be creating a musical narrative, right? And this is something I'm free improvising. I might identify a certain energetic flow and like go with it, and then try to find the right moment to have an ending. I might identify like a thematic piece of material and improvise with that for a while, like tell the story of that little character. But I think the visuals can also have a story. And this is actually one of the things I love about this project is it kind of connects to this idea of synesthesia. Like I like to, when I play, I like to be able to see the graphics, and so they feed back to me too. And so for that algorithm, I have some foot pedals here, and I can just trigger a transformation in the graphics.
Ah, I was
And so
wondering
to me
about
that
that. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
to me that
some sort of foot
becomes
pedal.
like I want to build up to a moment in the music. And again, this is free improvisation, so it'll be different every time. But I know that I want to arrive at a moment that kind of feels like it wants to open onto something, and then I'll trigger a change in the graphics.
I was curious if you also were modifying the length of the tremolos via some sort of control as well, when they cut off, when they died down.
Right. So, well, the tremolos were all had to do with my holding the pedal down. So the tremolo is almost like
Oh,
a
okay.
piano pedal on steroids. But there's also other
For
things I'm doing with the
sustain.
tremolo. Yeah, they're like the sustain, a super crazy sustain. But I also have a volume pedal where I'm turning the tremolo up and down. So like many elements in this project that might seem like they're computer generated are actually me controlling the beast. Because again, I don't want the computer to be too smart.
Becomes
I'm the
dangerous.
artist here. Yeah.
Some more questions from the audience we had. There was one from Christopher, I think. Yeah, I like this question here. Someone he knows uses a slow sideshow of photos to inspire their improvisation. Have you tried algorithmic visual sensory input?
Yeah, that actually really connects with what I was just saying about one thing that I should show you before we leave is this algorithm I call Triad sculpture, where every time I play harmony in my left hand, it creates a 3D shape that exactly shows, using a 3D Lysagers figure, basically, the harmonic ratios between the notes. And I can't tell you how much looking at those shapes is emotional to me. Like it really inspires the music. And that's also true of the other two I showed you today. Those visuals just have a way of inspiring me. So absolutely.
There's more questions over here. I don't know if these are queued up or not, but someone oh, you guys are very quick. He thinks it's really incredible. The algorithm is also incredible, as well as you're playing. Do you plan to release the code of the app so we can try this ourselves with our own MIDI devices?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been asked a few times. And by the way, thank you for saying that, Lucas. So, this connects to what we were saying earlier. It's like the act of generosity towards your audience, of putting things in a form that people can use. I've really enjoyed with this project keeping my code in a very kind of hacky, very homemade form because I'm constantly tweaking it. And the process involved in putting it in a form that would be understandable and usable by other people would be a lot of work. And so that's something we have done with Farplay because I think that's useful, hopefully, to a really large number of people. But this, I haven't done that yet. But there are other projects. I actually can't remember right now what it was called, but there was one project that endeavored to do exactly what you're saying, which is allow people to create whatever algorithms they want for their keyboards or for their piano.
You could open source it. We can find you in GitHub.
Yeah, You could.
or you could sell it.
But then people would
Speaking of
ask me
which,
questions all the time.
you have to maintain it and have the feature
Yeah.
requests, and it'd be a full-time job.
I kind
There's
of
another
want to keep it
question
about
here.
the art.
Yeah, that's what I really admire about this, is that there's a spiritual center that's always there. That's what things are. Everything else is in service of a musical and artistic goal, not a pure mathematical or algorithmic goal.
Totally. I'll get super excited about ideas, and then if they don't work musically, I'm like, nah, let's find something that works.
There's a question from DJ where he asks about, we use the word roadmap around here a lot at Google, but really, what are you doing next?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for me as an artist, I get super excited about this kind of thing, and in particular, working with algorithms in this way has felt very inspiring in my life because I spent so much of my artistic life in areas that are very well trodden, like playing Bach or like improvising jazz. It's like there are so many brilliant people who have done this, and suddenly this world feels incredibly virgin in comparison. Because there are actually very, very few people doing this kind of work, and especially people who have the kind of experience as a performer that I have. So that said, I feel that none of this work with technology has any value unless I'm coming at it from a really competent musical place. So as much as I push in the technological direction, my kind of immediate thing that I always feel like doing in parallel is diving really deep into my musical ability and my understanding of the musical history. So as I mentioned, I have this new Bach project. I also I'm doing a practice series right now where I post a little video every day of what I'm practicing, and just the idea of practicing as both a practical thing to do, but also as basically a spiritual practice is really interesting to me. And so this is a long way of saying I just kind of want to keep getting better at music and then keep plugging away at these ideas, these algorithms. I'm constantly adding new things that I don't have time to show you today. But that's just it. I mean, I think exploring what I can do with AI, like getting neural networks involved, is something I want to do at some point, and we'll just see where it goes.
I think this is a great goal personally. I believe in the same kind of thing. Instead of saying next year, I'm going to win a Grammy, more we go on doing the work that is meaningful and keep on doing the work, trying to do it well. And for people at Google, instead of saying, I'm going to be L9 next year,
Mm-hmm.
do good work. That means things to you and people around you.
Yeah, there's this big idea in Alexander technique, which is a philosophy of body use that I love. It's been around since the late 19th century. It's this idea of end gaining. And end gaining is, for example, what you do if you're being pursued by a monster and you need to get into your house and you're extremely agitated. And so you fumble with your keys because you absolutely need to get that door open, and you end up dropping your keys and just everything goes to hell and you get eaten by the monster. That's because you're end gaining. You're looking too much at what your goal is instead of being in the moment. And so if you just kind of keep calm, get your keys out of the pocket, something you've done a million times and you're able to do, open the door, then you're going to be fine. So yeah, I try to not end gain. Just stay in putting one foot in front of the other.
I've heard also said this way that we think we're in the driver's seat. Sometimes it's better to be in the passenger seat.
Oh, I like that.
It's not my
Yeah,
idea. I love that one though.
actually, Joe Henderson, who's one of my heroes in jazz, really, really great jazz saxophonist, he said in liner notes to one of his albums that it's stressful to him to be a leader on a record because it's like his artistic vision and all that. And what he tries to do when he's making a record is just pretend like he's a sideman.
Wow, I love that idea. I know we're running out of time. I could ask you questions all day long, but do you have any things you want to say in the closing minute or so of our time here?
I would love to show this one last one, the Triad sculpture. It's just one of my favorite of these algorithms. And as I explained, it's one where when I play harmonies in my left hand, my program immediately generates a 3D visualization of the harmonic ratios, literally the whole number ratios between the tones and the chord, according to the way Pythagoras thought of these things. So here's, for example, a major triad. Isn't that pretty? That's ratios 4 to 5 to 6, which are major triad, and this
Harmony
is a minor triad.
Ooh, more
which is
complicated.
ratios 10 to 12 to 15, more complicated, exactly. And we hear that in the interaction of the tones. Funnily enough, though, they're actually the same thing, but upside down, right? Minor triad's an
Yes.
inversion of a major triad. In any case, let me just do a very quick improvisation with this idea here. I just love doing this.
Yeah, the producer says go for it, so go for it.
Okay, beautiful.
That I didn't see coming that the harmony began to expand outwards in both directions. You had to play along with it as it changed, as it reached various tones you recognized.
Yeah, well,
That
Ben,
was
you have
pretty
really great
cool.
ears. I get to see you identify right away what's going on there. But
Mm.
this is another thing that came out of this algorithm. Like I started with this idea of how can I represent visually these harmonic ratios between tones, and then as you might have heard, I'm also playing those with sine waves in the computer. Right, this is the only algorithm where sound is coming out of the computer that's not coming directly from the piano, because I wanted to hear them in those just intonation ratios. But then I asked myself, what if I just started modifying those ratios and detuning them as I go? And so that's what's happening there. That's what I did there at the end. Is I started with a unison of three notes, and then the outer two were just pulling apart from each other, and it creates this kind of progression as it's happening.
Yeah. You get octaves at the end and you can end the piece.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's really cool. I know we're past time, so probably we should stop talking. But if you haven't done this already, you should Google or Bing or your favorite search engine. Check out Dan Tepfer. You'll find his website, his performances, his music, his recordings, these shapes, all kinds of things. And thanks so much for joining us today at Talks at Google.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I couldn't think of a better person to talk to. It's so cool that you have this deep understanding of music and experience. And thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, thanks. It was really a pleasure. I learned a ton.